Hey guys, and welcome back to Hear Me Roar. I'm your host, Rory Cassandra, and I'm a holistic wellness mentor. I work with badass women to drop self sabotage, learned behavior, and limiting beliefs as they step into their most authentic selves by healing from the inside out. Here we will chat about all things health mind, body, and spirit, which will give you an encompassing understanding of what wellness truly has to offer. Join us for some juicy, unedited, unscripted discussions with professionals in this space and also some soul discovering and experiences of my own. Thanks for being here. I hope you enjoy, and let's dive in. In this episode, I have Steph Sivandos, and he is a love and relationship coach and a masculine and feminine expert. And we talk a lot about the different energetics of masculine and feminine, unhealthy, healthy, what they look like. But a huge piece of what we talked about a little bit was in a relationship, there is three big separations. I say this all the time. You are your own entity, your partner is another entity, and this relationship is that third entity. And to really get the relationship that you want, the focus needs to be on you to attract that and to work on yourself and look at your triggers and look at your boundaries and look at your shadows in order to be able to attract what you truly desire. And keep in mind that any relationship that exists, platonic, romantic, familial, it can always serve as a mirror. And we can always point our finger and say, that person's doing this, and that is mean, and that's not right. But where can we turn inward? Where can we see what's going on for us that's bringing that up within us? So, in this conversation, we talk about how to lean into that undesirable feeling, how to feel those feelings, um, and really breaking down the barriers of thinking that men show up one way and women show up another way. It really is a continual dance in relationship. And in order to have that healthy relationship, there needs to be this inner work done within yourself. So I hope you guys enjoy and let me know what you think. Welcome back to Hear Me Roar. On this episode, I have Steph. He is a love and relationship coach and masculine and feminine expert. And for everyone who knows me and knows my personal development journey, they know that Steph is married to Christine Hassler, who is a really big guide for me and push into this work. So hello, Steph. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your story, what got you into this work, and what your kind of niche is with everything.
Yeah, so what really got me into this work is this yearning for deeper connection to my own self, to understand who I was and my own mind and heart. And really, I came from a place of feeling very isolated, feeling very alone. I grew up in a pretty violent upbringing. There's a lot of volatility there, unpredictability, and I sort of really I just didn't know how to deal with that as a kid. And so I really shut down. Then as a teenager, I aggressed and became violent myself, and as a young adult. And it took some time to come into some level of balance and stop moving in extremes. But from a very young age, I really wanted to help people because I wanted to help myself. Dr. John DeMartini often says that our greatest voids become our greatest values. And so in isolation, I sought connection. In feeling alone and feeling very confused, I sought clarity. And so, and not receiving, I sought giving. And so that's in part how I got here. However, it was a very tumultuous, turbulent path that I took. Which was challenging, like really, really challenging. And we all go through that. Like we usually go through the fire to almost be reincarnated, or to, that phoenix rising from the ashes. So we all have that multiple times in our lives. And for me, one of the greatest catalysts for that was a relationship I was in a few years ago, where she discovered I was unfaithful in that partnership, and I was really not behaving in accordance with what I was saying. I was way out of integrity, and I was very much living in shadows. And that became a massive catalyst for really looking at my stuff at a deeper level, because I'd been doing it from a very young age, but I was only getting my feet wet. I would only do it if it was convenient. I would only look at my stuff if it wasn't too painful.
Right.
But I made a decision there and then to go really deep, and I haven't looked back. And it's been deeply transformative. And it was big for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd love to go a little bit deeper into that turning point for you. And I know there's kind of both sides of the spectrum, right? Men who maybe have um, anger and violence or whatever that may be really close and near and dear, and it's very easy to access. And then men on the other side of the aspect that feel fear of kind of bringing that primalness out. Maybe they don't have that much access to anger based on, how they grew up or whatnot. But I'm curious for you, what was that tipping point of realizing, hey, I'm not living in integrity and I want to do better for me? And then in turn show up as a coach and serve others in that way.
For me, it was that relationship, and it was the shame that came to me when I witnessed what my actions had contributed to the relationship, how they contributed to the relationships, and watching her in so much pain.
Mm.
And many memories came flooding back to me that I had suppressed from my childhood, being in trauma and so forth. And that was intense. And so that was the tipping point for me. And I just said to myself, I've got basically one of two choices: continue the way I'm being, and being in arrogance and ignorance and shadow, and ultimately a lot of pain and avoidance,
Mm.
and fear, lots of fear, which was masked with a false sense of being and a facade.
Mm.
Or go real deep, make some changes, and just fucking go all in.
Right.
And that's what I chose to do. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious now with the work that you do, can you tell everyone a little bit about what you do now and how you help people kind of make those shifts in their life in regards to relationship? And, I know that you hone in a lot about the masculine and the feminine. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So a great deal of the work that I do today is really helping people relate to themselves with greater effectiveness and greater efficiency, which is very linear and quote unquote masculine energetic, but also with greater compassion and greater wholeness.
Mm.
And so you see, for me, life is, you often hear that saying, well, there's two types of people in the world. There's this type of person and that type of person, this type of person, and people put their own spin on it, right? And so for me, there's two types of experiences in the world. There's desirable experiences and undesirable experiences, but there's no bad and good experiences or right and wrong experiences. We just gravitate towards what's desirable more often than we what's undesirable. However, the undesirable experiences still carry value. For example, most of us grow up experiencing some level of trauma, some level of pain, difficulty, challenges, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we often then become very averse to that. We begin to avoid that because it's painful.
Mm-hmm.
There's fear there, there's discomfort there. And we want to be, we're creatures of comfort, right? Yeah. The brain is a creature of comfort, or is an organ or an organism in and of itself of comfort. It wants patterns, it seeks patterns that are going to ensure its safety and survival. The body and the nervous system is an extension of that, and so is our psyche, right? Mm-hmm. And so, we are seeking that. However, what happens is, in seeking the joy and the happiness and the bliss and the ease in life, we negate the value of what these other really important states give us: sadness, anger, rage, depression, torment, whatever it may be, pain, etc., etc. So I really just help people absorb and see the undesirable as something of value with a neutral lens, and observe it as opposed to judge it, and observe it as opposed to critique it, and then avoid it, which ends up being our shadows. And we then behave, because it leaks out. We then behave in these ways that aren't healthy for us or for others, which end up perpetuating more of what we actually don't want. But then we're trying to hide it with more, with more what we shouldn't be doing, and we get caught. And so I just really help people relate to each other at a deep, at a more profound level, and help them know that they're safe in experiencing these very uncomfortable, undesirable emotions. And just because they're undesirable doesn't make them wrong. And there's just as much value in them as happiness and joy, and those comfortable, desirable emotions, right? The love and the connection and the feeling of belongingness and all of that. Here's the paradox: the more we lean into these uncomfortable, undesirable situations, the faster they pass, the quicker we learn, the more we grow, and the greater we expand. And expansion and growth is a prime directive of being human on this earth.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, like you're saying, there needs to be some sort of wall shattered to give yourself permission to feel those undesirable feelings. So I'm curious for you, what's the first step for people if they're so scared of their shadows and they're so scared of these undesirable, quote unquote, bad feelings?
Mm.
How do you advise people to lean into that a little bit more?
I would advise people, see, I'm a big proponent of self-reliance. And self-reliance is a human thing that we all require, and it's part of being a masculine energetic. More, it can be associated with a masculine energetic.
Mm-hmm.
And in its unhealthy form, it's hyper independence. Its
Mm-hmm.
unhealthy form, it's isolating, it's I'm going to do it all on my own, it's hyper competitive and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Self-reliance is really important because it builds confidence, it builds character, it builds a deeper understanding and connection to who we are, it opens up our hearts, welcomes in other people's perspectives and so forth. Self-reliance also says, hey, I can do this. And if I really can't, I'm going to lean into someone else. And so that's where I'm going with this is be self-reliant. Absolutely. 100% yes. And seek support, because sometimes we can't see the forest through the trees. We just get so stuck in our own perspectives that we keep going in circles. And so being in a support group, seeking a counselor, a psychologist, a shaman, a spiritual healer, a guide, a friend,
Mm-hmm.
something you can bounce ideas off and that can be really honest with you, and that honesty, trust, and respect is reciprocated. And they can say, you know what? Hey, if you're willing to hear this, here's my perspective. That's going to be really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think from my experience, I lived a lot of my younger years in that unhealthy masculine,
Yeah.
in that going, that doing, like you said, that hyper independence, right? Like I don't
Mm,
need anyone else, right? So for people to realize that asking for help is not a bad thing, right? And really
no,
leaning into
it's not.
support.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to give some examples of the unhealthy, masculine or toxic feminine, what that looks like, and then how that may show up in relationship for people.
So in terms of the for me, toxic is the term toxic is just an unsustainable way of being in the world, right?
Mm,
Um, and we were talking about wounded masculine or wounded feminine per se. There are many different characteristics to that, and so it becomes important to understand that the masculine and these masculine feminine energetics, right? They reside within every single one of us. They play a role in all of our lives. It doesn't matter if you're a male or a female.
mhm,
They're not set to um, gender dynamics per se. Gender's part of it. Absolutely, we can't completely disassociate the physical body or one's gender, or one's sexuality from the masculine feminine energetic. But masculine feminine energetics reside within every single one of us,
mhm,
and it's really important to understand that. And so when we're looking at a wounded, say a wounded masculine energetic, or shadow, you can call it a um, shadow masculine.
mhm,
We're talking about the masculine hides from the world, weak in conviction, lacks in self-belief, relies on others for direction, fears wrong. That's more of an inwardly directed shadow masculine. An outwardly directed shadow masculine, as an example, is controlling, is subjugating, is oppressive, is forceful, is self-loathing, is angry, is full of rage, is hyper competitive. There's some examples, some characteristics. And how that may play out in a relationship is that the person that's hyper masculine in that relationship is in constant competition with their partner.
mm,
I mean, at trying to outdo their partner.
mm,
Or if they're weak in their conviction, how that plays out in the relationship is being a people pleaser and letting everyone else make decisions for them.
mm,
If they're hiding from the world or hiding from their relationship, they're not going to speak their truth into that container. They're going to hide their emotional body. They're not going to be trusting and trustworthy. They're not going to be more aware. And so there's issues that come with that in relationship. In terms of like an inwardly directed shadow feminine, we can look at living in secrets, contorting self to fit in,
mm,
places other people on pedestals in an extreme way, is insecure, carries a body dysmorphia, or is anxious. There's this constant anxiousness, anxiety. A more outwardly projected shadow feminine trait would be maybe passive aggressiveness, manipulative, unhealthy sexual expression, being irritable, being a people pleaser, The unhealthy sexual expression for the outwardly directed shadow masculine, just the shadow masculine, is um, dominating sexual activity, gaining power through sex. That can be more of that masculine energetic that's unhealthy. How does the inward shadow feminine, or how does shadow feminine traits or qualities show up in relationship potentially? If one is insecure, they're placing all their power in the other's hands. That can be very difficult for the other person, but also, being insecure is not an attractive trait. Body dysmorphia, there's a hiding there. You're never going to show yourself. You're going to be drawn back in sexual intimacy and even emotional intimacy. If you're consistently irritable, as an extreme extension or expression of a shadow feminine trait, if you're consistently irritable, you're going to be taking that out on your partner. They're going to be walking on eggshells. You're going to be distancing yourselves and isolating. So there's some of the ways. I mean, there's obviously a hell of a lot more, but there's some there.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm curious, would you say that most of these things stem from childhood? Like, is that something that you were?
Yeah, childhood and adolescence. Yeah, so adolescent behavior, adolescent exposure, the peer groups that we form or don't form during our adolescent years, childhood experiences during our developmental years and the various developmental phases during childhood, our relationships with our primary caregivers and or parents, how we see ourselves, which influences and impacts our self-worth, self-esteem, and worth, like our sense of worthiness in the world. So yeah, most of that comes from there. And these are patterns that are developed at a neurological, behavioral, emotional, spiritual level that we take on into our adult lives, and they just continue if they're left unchecked.
Yeah, I'm curious for you. Do you work with primarily men, primarily women, both?
Both, honestly, both, and relationship and couples as well.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an even spread.
Yeah, and I'm curious for you, and I know everyone's different, but so people start doing the work, right? They start uncovering what is theirs, what's their partner's, right? I'm a big believer in, they're all separate entities. You have your own, your partner has your own, and then this relationship is this third container.
Yep.
So I'm curious what the emotions are typically tied with that. I mean, I think for me, a lot of shame and guilt were when I was uncovering a lot of my shadows. I think those were really prevalent for me, and a lot of judgment. And I'm curious, do you see men typically go one way, women go another? What's your take on that? The emotions that are tied to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Depends on their personality types, depends on their own disposition and personal experiences. Men generally would tend to go more aggressive, more angry, more shame, more guilt. Females generally can withdraw, a lot of self-pity, feeling really fragile, really withdraw from the world. But men can do that as well. It's not a male-female thing. With that as well, you sort of look at the unpacking or uncovering or doing the quote unquote doing the work process as a grieving process. There are various stages that you're going to go through of awareness and excitement, then guilt and shame and anger, and then despondency and a feeling of lostness and loneliness and all of this. So you're definitely going to move through all these different stages. Sometimes we'll oscillate and we'll go back and forth, up and down, left and right. So, once you feel the guilt and shame, don't think that it may not come back again. It very well may, because you're unpacking more layers. So you go into a deeper level of guilt and shame. But core emotions that we're going to feel through the unpacking of self process is guilt and shame, is anger at self and others, is a deep sadness, is a sense of loneliness, is irritability, is this feeling of I feel lost, I feel confused. These are big feelings, emotions, and states that we will experience during the unpacking process. And part of that is also joy and excitement. You're going to and hope. You're going to experience hope, and then you're going to experience heaviness because it's like, I feel burdened now. I'm going to make these changes. How do I do it? So there's a lot of emotions that we feel on that spectrum.
Yeah, and I think it can be daunting too.
Very.
I think especially if you're kind of in a partnership where, a lot of my clients are females. So I have a lot of feedback of, hey, I'm doing the work. I feel like my partner's not, or I feel like I'm pushing him into it. Right.
Yeah, get that as well.
And it's hard because that's not your responsibility as a woman, whether you're the woman or the man in the relationship. You can't force your partner to change or do the work. They need it for themselves. But I'm curious if we want to talk a little bit about intimacy, and, say both people are doing the work, right? They're both doing their both individual work. I'm curious, can you just talk about the relationship and how that's shifted when each are doing the work, and, communication and intimacy, and how all of that is affected when both people are coming together in alignment versus, when maybe one's doing the work, one's not doing the work, things like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So ultimately, when people are both doing the work, there's a willingness that takes place, and in that willingness, there's a deeper connection that's formed as well, because you both have common goals that you're reaching for and that you're striving for, that you're connecting on. And so the intimacy is deepened because you're now speaking to quite deeply profound issues and matters that are unraveling in your own life, and you're able to share that with someone that sees you and understands you. So there's a resonance there, and there's a what we call sorry, the words just eluded me. Uh, Attunement. Sorry, just
Mhm.
got out of my head. So attunement is essentially where we're able to emotionally read each other and then
Mhm.
be there for each other in that way and give each other what we need. What's generally happening is when both people are doing the work, it becomes less about receiving and more about giving. Because we
Mhm.
know that if there's a commitment for both people to do the work, they're giving to themselves, they're giving to their partners, and they're giving to their relationships, to the relationship. And in that sense, there's a trust and confidence that's going to take place, and therefore you're receiving. So the focus becomes on giving, but you're receiving so much. And so there's a reciprocity there that's quite balanced.
Mhm.
And you're less about what you're not getting and more about what you're able to give, because you realize that what you're giving the other person is exactly what you need. Let me give you an example. So you have a couple that are together, and one of the chief complaints from person A is that person B isn't emotional enough. They don't express, they're not proactive enough. They're not really proactive with expressing their feelings. It would so happen to be that person B, um, one of their core wounds, one of their issues is that they're unable to emotionally express. So what person A wants from them is actually a gift for person B to come into a more whole state of being, as opposed to being limited by a linear way of thinking, or being more cognitive, or being more analytical, and not being able to emote in a healthy way, not being able to access the range of their own emotions. So what may appear demanding from person A is actually what person B needs. And so person B gives that to person A. Not only are they giving to person A what they need, person B is really receiving what they need to heal some of those old wounds that maybe have been perpetuated from a younger age or previous relationships. And so we just have to dig below the surface to see that we often feel that our partners are putting pressure on us to be a particular way. More often than not, the way they're asking us to be is what we need for ourselves. It's when that ask is demanded, when
Mhm.
it's not conscious, when it's immature, when it's coming from a place of fear and victim, hopeless, helpless, and you're not giving to me, and selfishness, that you forget about what you need and what they need, and you're focusing on surviving because it's triggering a stress response in the body. Cortisol, adrenaline's running through the body. It's triggering a survival response.
Mhm.
And so that becomes the focus, as opposed to how can we actually heal each other.
Mhm.
And what is being asked of me, if it's asked in a really healthy, mature, open, transparent way, it's actually going to help me. So why wouldn't I want that? And that's the magic of coming together in relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's beautiful. I mean, two things that I really loved there was, more receiving, less doing. And that's, like you said, it's organic, right? I think personally, I've been there when I've been giving and giving from this empty tank, and then
Mm,
expectations show up and attachments show up, and it's not giving from this authentic place of free flow. It's giving with some sort of attachment tied to it, or expectation to come back, and then it's not authentic, and then it doesn't feel good, and my partner will feel that. um
yep.
and then I love what you said, basically tying it together is like your partner is your mirror, right? And they're going to show
Yep.
you what you need to see, what you need to heal. And I think that's the opportunity. And I think for me, that's the first opportunity for people to be like, oh, what can I look at that's mine here? So many
Mm,
people that I've talked to can play victim in that sense and point fingers and say they do this or they do that. And it's like, oh, okay, well, where can you take that inventory on your own life and your own triggers and realize that there's opportunity to heal within? And even if the other person is projecting some of their own stuff, there's still an opportunity to look within to figure out how you can even show up better for yourself, regardless of,
mm.
your partner or not.
Yeah, and that there is the self-reliant, self-responsible
Hmm.
ownership piece.
Right.
Is that there? Yeah.
Right. So tell me a little bit about, so again, I work with primarily women, and most of my audience is women. And
Okay.
how can a woman attract, even though I feel like I know the short answer of this, I'd love for you to expand a little bit about, women who are doing the work, they want to find a partner who will do the work with them, who will meet them where they want to be met. And it doesn't necessarily need to be just women, men are doing the work out there as well, of
Sure.
course. So I'm curious, what does attracting your ideal partner look like, other than, or maybe just expanding on, doing your piece of it and doing your
Mm,
work?
mm. What does attracting your ideal partner look like? It's really difficult to not go or to go beyond you've got to live your life based on your values and what's important to you. You've got to know yourself. You've got to be, and you're never going to fully know yourself per se, but you've got to be willing to be in that process. And that does mean doing your inner work, being responsible for your pain points, your fears, how you celebrate, how you experience joy and happiness. Ultimately living your best life according to you and not contorting yourself to fit into someone else's mold. And here's the thing, if we're doing that, if we're contorting ourselves to fit into someone's idea of who we need to be, there's a wound or a shadow there that we're not addressing, so we have to address it. So, if you're talking about attraction dynamics, it helps to understand and know some of the science or some of the with the techniques behind sexual attraction and emotional intimate attraction, romantic attraction, what all that looks like. But that's sort of secondary to knowing you. What is most important to you? What do you really desire and want in a relationship? And are you then living that authentically in your own life? Because otherwise you're just going to attract what you don't want. And therefore you're going to be met with friction and tension consistently. And we are the common denominators in our lives, whether we like to admit it or not. And so it's really important that you're living your best life. If you're a yogini and you just love doing yoga, then just keep doing yoga. If you want to live in a particular place, and do your best to do everything you can to live in that environment. If you are pursuing a particular expression or career in the world or purpose or service, then do that and trust that people that align with your non-negotiables, and values and non-negotiables are different. Non-negotiables is like, this is what I will not tolerate, and we're only meant to really have a couple of those, or very few at least, right? Otherwise then you're sort of limiting yourself to what is for you. But part of the non-negotiables and knowing what you don't want is knowing what you do want, and knowing who you are and living that life, having a very real experience of that. And there's no real, I know that's not super sexy, but there's no real fucking magic about it. It's just be fucking you in the world. Like really be you. The difficulty with being you in the world is that it pushes us to our edges of, well, aren't I meant to be someone else's version of me? I.e. my mother's, my father's, my brother's, my teachers, the world, society, our culture, whatever. That's the issue, but that's what we have to work through to get into that level of self-appreciation, self-worth, heightened self-worth, and sovereignty. And I know that doesn't sound super pretty, but that's what it's really about.
Yeah.
For me.
Totally. I agree. And I think the embodiment piece is a really big piece of that, right? You can know what your non-negotiables are. You can know what you want to attract, but until you're actually living that yourself, you're still going to attract the shadows of yourself. And it's funny because I didn't date for 3.5 years. And then I met my partner. I've been with him for a little over a year, and relationships are so healing, and he's shown me different pieces of myself and different sides of myself that I never saw within myself because they weren't in front of my face to mirror back to me. So I think relationships can be just this beautiful healing container. And I think there's a sense of trust and surrender that needs to go on, right? If you're going to commit to somebody and you're going to engage in a romantic relationship, really being all in on it, really committing yourself to it, to be open to the messages that you're meant to receive, the things that you're meant to move on with. Do you have anything to say about that particularly?
I think what I really liked about what you said then is that if we don't face, and I'm paraphrasing, but if we don't face, all of essentially who we are, our shadows are dominant in our lives, and they run our lives, and they run the course of the relationship as well, and the direction of the relationship. Because even though they're in the shadows, they're unseen, they're unconscious, they're so powerful. And the unconscious self is 90+% of all of that we are. And that's where we get confused. We think, but I have this dream and I have this idea and I'm aware of it. Why isn't it happening? Because there's something that's pushing against that
Mhm.
where you feel like you're upstream all the time, whether it's in relationship or in relationship with yourself, that we're not addressing. We have to address that.
Right.
That's what I like. Yeah, that's what I
Yeah.
like about
Yeah, and I'm curious, as we kind of sort of wrap up here, I'm curious for females out there. I think because we live in a patriarchal society, because this society is just so fast paced. I see a lot of women in their masculine, right? And their inability to slow down, their inability to step into that soft surrender, trust piece of who they really are, trusting their intuition. But I'm curious if you have any tips or tricks of, females who may be in their masculine and not even really recognizing. How can you step more into your feminine? How can you show up in your feminine and step more into flow?
So some of the characteristics with that, we live in. I'm careful with the word patriarch and patriarchy. It can be a really loaded word for many
Mhm.
reasons, and historically and even in a contemporary sense. However, we do live in a world that is really dominated by masculine energetics. And this isn't right or wrong.
Mhm.
But when anything is dominated, it almost becomes out of balance and hyper and quote unquote extreme, quote unquote unsustainable, quote unquote toxic. Masculinity isn't toxic. Because if masculinity is toxic, then by default, femininity has to be toxic as well, or at least aspects of it.
Right.
Because you can't have one thing without the other. They're two wings of the same bird. So we live in a world where we're dominated by masculine energetics. It's about go energy, it's about accomplishments, it's about completion, it's about goals, it's about attainment, it's about status, it's about wealth, it's about material possessions, it's about titles. And we almost go to the extremes of that. We sacrifice other values for these things. And if we live in a hyper competitive society, culturally, socially, economically. And if you want to be part of that society, if you want to be in the in group, which is very neurological within us and obviously psychological within us, then you've got to sort of adhere to what the status quo is doing, the in group. Otherwise, you're in the out group. And that feels very not healthy for us. So we've evolved to avoid being in the out group because that has surely meant death.
Right.
So if you're in that energetic of overdoing and competing and deadlines and it's linear and it's analytical thinking, all of those things that I've just said do the opposite.
Mhm.
And here's why I'm not going to tell you what those things are. Because part of the feminine is being creative.
Mhm.
And in your creativity, you get to explore and source what does the opposite of that mean for you.
Mm.
And that's part of being in that feminine energetic and being in that flow. So rather than me telling you what are the characteristics of being in that more feminine energetic,
Mhm.
seek,
Right.
not find.
Right. Right. And I think that comes from like inner trust and
Yes.
really understanding and trusting yourself that you'll figure it out. Right. I think so many
Intuition.
people,
Mm.
yeah, forget that they have this inner knowing, right? They look so much for the outside world to tell them or to validate them if things are right or wrong.
Yes.
And we have the answers within.
Yes.
So I think that's a huge piece of it. Do you have anything else that you really want to feel compelled to share and talk about? I know we could go in like a million different directions with all of the work that you do, but I'm curious if you have anything else that you feel compelled to share about, this topic specifically.
Yeah, well, topic around relation. I mean, I could share a lot. Obviously, I'm sure we could keep going. It's a great flow of conversation. I'd say this. I'd say relationships are not meant to be hard and arduous, and they're meant to be challenging.
Mm.
Like, so relationships require effort, and there should be a healthy balance of flow and understanding, and it requires effort to get there. Like, you got to get to know yourself. You got to know yourself to get to know the other, to understand the dynamics of the relationship.
Mm.
But we give up really easy in our world today when we're faced with a hard decision or a difficult time, particularly in relationships. It's just so easy to just say, oh, you know what, I'm going to dump you and go to the next one. Or
Mm.
I'll rather be by myself, or I'll chase the sun, or whatever it is that I'll do. No, I used to be like that. It's like one argument in a relationship, like, well, we're not meant to be together, this relationship's over. And
Mm.
that's just me coming from a lot of childhood wounding, fear of commitment, fear of freedom, fear of being seen, fear of intimacy. It's just, we can go well beyond that. But we've got to work on our own stuff. And sometimes we give up too early in relationship. And I'm not saying every relationship is a relationship we need to be in. However, look, so some relationships only last for a season or a reason and not a lifetime, so to speak. However, I think we give up too early in relationships because we're unwilling to look at our own stuff because it's too painful. And that's what relationships do. They're a mirror. Coming back full circle to the beginning of the conversation. They're a mirror and they're also a light. They shine a very bright light on the parts of us that we haven't seen for a long time, or that we're unwilling to see, or that we deem to be ugly
Mm.
or unnecessary, or that we judge very harshly. And that's really difficult for the ego to hold and handle. And so the more inner work we do, where we're building resilience and self-reliance and confidence, and we're connecting deeper to these parts of ourselves that we um, actually value, the more whole we feel, and we bring that wholeness into relationships, and the more willing we are to actually remain in that relationship.
Mm. Yeah. And I love that word willingness, right? Because I think
Yeah.
that's that openness and that willingness to do the work. And um, I am somebody who is avoidant, if I were to label myself with an attachment style.
Mm.
Um, and I think in the past, I was definitely a runner, right? Met with conflict. I'm like, cool, not dealing with this from past relationships that, put too much effort in, maybe wasn't the right person. But I'm curious, and again, super individualized for everyone. And I think it's really about finding your own boundaries and your own non-negotiables. But where do you think that line is between that willingness to work with the person versus, okay, this is unhealthy for me. This is, I'm putting in all of the work, or I'm doing all of it. My partner's not meeting me. And again, super individualized, but I'm curious, is there a line for you that you would say that you see often with people?
The line is the deeper someone knows themselves, the deeper they trust themselves.
Mhm.
And that comes from just continuous exploration in all the realms of being,
Right.
in our mental faculties, emotional relationships, our childhoods, our values, what's important to us, etc. The more one knows themselves, the more distinct that line is, where they can say, look, this is unhealthy for me. I've done all I can really do. I can't do anymore. You're going to have to meet me. It doesn't even have to be halfway, but you're going to have to meet me. And
Mhm.
if you can't, then I'm making a self-honoring choice to leave this dynamic.
Yeah.
That becomes more clear the more clear someone is about who they are, what their non-negotiables are, what they will tolerate and won't.
Mhm.
How deeply they've cultivated compassion and empathy within themselves,
Mhm.
towards their own inner child, and towards that then is then um, transferred to others. And there can be a deeper level of patience and persistence that comes from that, without taking it personally. Because often what happens is we take life personally. We take life as an attack on us. The reality is it's often not. It feels that way, sure, because we find it hard to distinguish between the parts within ourselves, and to feel the wholeness of who we are. The reality is that person is lashing out at us because they're feeling pain, abandoned, rejected, whatever. They're recognizing a pattern in their environment. And part of maybe what you're doing is reminding them of something very painful. And in order to protect themselves, they're lashing out at you, or they're withdrawing, or whatever their protective strategy is.
Mhm.
But you're just a reminder. And that action that you're taking, or that way that you're being, is something that is far older within them than it is within you. And so from that perspective, I don't even know if rejection actually really exists. It's more of a projection rather than a rejection.
Right.
And the more work we do in ourselves, and the more inner healing we do in ourselves, we're able to recognize that, and we don't react. And the less we react, the more we reinforce a healing within ourselves, but B, reinforce a healing within them, because in the past they would have been met with reaction,
Mhm.
which perpetuates the same pattern
Okay.
and the same type of the way of being. But
Mhm.
if they're met with compassion and patience, they're like, whoa, hold on a minute, we're not usually met with that. Let me push more.
Mhm.
And then you keep meeting them with compassion, they just go, oh, wow, there's a different way to be here. And then there's a pattern that breaks in them. They get a new level of self-awareness. They can then show up differently in the relationship. So the relationship then is, quote unquote, prolonged to the point where you can both heal and you can both gain from it at a deeper level.
Yeah.
And the more we do that, and the more awareness we have around that, the more the decision comes from, should we be together or shouldn't we? And there's greater clarity around that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love that. I mean, at the end of the day, you need to make self-honoring choices, right? They need to be aligned with you and your bigger future. Um, but I love the piece of, the non-reactive side, right? I think for somebody to show up the way that they might want to show up, they need to be met with that safety and compassion. And sometimes, your partner needs to lead you there and hold that space for you. And I think that's a big piece too. I think we're stepping out of this realm of men need to look one way, women need to look another way and act one way in the relationship. And like you were touching on in the beginning of this conversation, right? It's not gender specific. And yes, there's gender involved, but sometimes the woman needs to step into the masculine role as the man steps into that compassion, softness, and it's kind of that dance. And I think it's really important too that everyone has a different balance within themselves, and it might work better for one person than it would for another. Um, and one thing, and the last thing I do want to talk about is conscious uncoupling. And what does that mean? What does that look like? I know that you talked about it briefly, but I'd love to just talk about that because we are talking about kind of knowing your boundaries with when to walk away from something.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, conscious uncoupling is just knowing that the relationship has run its course and it's just breaking up in a healthy way. Essentially, it's just remembering why you got together,
Hmm.
both consciously and unconsciously, because there are obvious reasons as to why you got together. Could be physical attraction, it could be a values alignment, combination of that, and obviously a lot more.
Hmm.
But we often at breakup, because it can push so much on our wounds of abandonment or rejection or I'm not enough, that we get to become defensive and we project and we get really angry.
Hmm.
And so we consciously uncouple by coming back to remembering why we got together and what have we learned? How have we grown? Can you see yourself in the other person? Can you treat the other person with reverence and respect? Can you look at what they've done for you and who they've been in the relationship, how you've grown, how they've grown? Can you process your emotions outside of the container as you're in that process of breaking up? Can you not blame and shame and project, but rather take responsibility and see the goodness in the relationship and how you've grown and recognize the growth overall, this is really, really important. These are some aspects of how to, there's a body of knowledge, of course, on how to consciously uncouple, but yeah, this is just one way we can be through this process.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. I feel like I said, we could talk about multiple things and continue on, but tell me a little bit about where people can find you, what you're getting into right now in your world of coaching.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell everyone what.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you can apply to work with me in a one-on-one capacity. Do a lot of deep one-on-one work with people that are ready to really plunge and not only go deep, but have a profound impact on their own life and the life of their partners or their lives of their communities and so forth. So really, really thoroughly enjoy that, and that's a big, big life calling for me.
Mhm.
My beautiful wife and I, Christine, we have a inner child workshop coming up next week, I believe. Level 1 and level 2 in September, end of September. So that's pretty cool. You can find me on Instagram, Stefanos Safandos, Facebook, YouTube, etc. But if you want to learn more about me, you can go to my main website, but you can go to my other website, which is Grow with Steph, growwithsteph.com, growwithsteph.com. There's a heap of freebies there. You can take a love block assessment, which helps you identify what your core wounds, fears, and love blocks are to relationships. It's all free. There's a free breathwork course there, information on how to work together, and just a heap of resources.
Awesome. Well, amazing. I'm so thankful and grateful for the work that you do and bring it forward, individually and with your wife. I think it's incredible. And I just appreciate you being on.
Thank you. Appreciate you too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks for tuning into this episode, you guys. If you enjoyed what you heard today, give a like and subscribe to my channel and podcast, and please share with anyone who you think would benefit from these discussions. If you feel inclined to write a review, please do so that more people can be exposed to my podcast and these types of discussions. So thanks for listening in on Hear Me Roar, and I will catch you guys in the next episode.